please rise. His Honour, Judge Chandler presiding. You may be seated. Case 67, the State versus David Bannister.
You are Mr. David Bannister?
That's correct, Your Honour.
And what does the defendant plead?
Not guilty, Your Honour.
Because this case represents the first of its kind in this country, I expect both the prosecution and the defence to take particular care in the presentation of their evidence and arguments to this court. I expect that all parties concerned understand the special nature of this case. Essentially, we are dealing with a law that has been on the statute books for decades, and in some countries, even centuries. Up until now, these laws have never been repealed, and therefore can still be enforced under existing state legislation. So, Counsel, we find ourselves with a very unique challenge.
Yeah, a strange thing happened to me a while back. I was working on my farm on Sunday, like any other Sunday, and my friends Mike and Nick turned up. Actually, they're policemen. And they called in to warn me, and it was a friendly warning, you know, that I needed to take this new Sunday law seriously. I mean, you know, they mentioned that it was a law that was enforced by the government and that it was good for the community and the country to have this one day set aside. You know, when they left, I listened to them out, you know, but when they left, man, was I angry. A law that's actually stripping our liberty of conscience and freedom of choice. Who is behind this, is what I asked back then.
I had been booked into a Bible Lands tour, and a friend of ours, or a friend of the family, Professor Fletcher, had encouraged me to meet up with Jim Arrabito. He was a history researcher.
Mr. Arrabito?
Yeah.
You've been expecting me.
Oh, you must be the one that Professor...
Fletcher.
That's right, Fletcher. Listen, there's no way we can talk around here. Why don't we go someplace that's a little quieter? Follow me.
But Professor Fletcher warned me that Jim may be reluctant to actually take me on because he feared his own life while researching this information on this particular Sunday law.
Now, how long have you been looking for me?
2 weeks.
2 weeks. I'm sorry. I hope you haven't wasted your time.
I hope not.
Now, let's get down to business. Now...
My name is Dave.
No, don't mention your name, whatever you do. I'm sure that we're under surveillance here.
Surveillance?
Yes, there's a fellow been following me. I'm gonna have to give you a fictitious name so we can talk. How about Terry? Is that okay? Now, Terry, what is it you think I can do for you?
Well, I want to come with you on this research on the new law.
No, it's absolutely impossible. Absolutely impossible.
Why not? I can be of a lot of help. And company.
No, it's not that. I'm sure I could use the company to help. It's just that this particular project is dangerous and I've got to do it alone. Terry, there's something you don't understand. Something that I'm just beginning to understand. And that's how dangerous thing is. You know, this isn't just a traffic ticket. This isn't even a federal offense type of thing. What it is an international power that would think nothing of just destroying you and your family.
The prosecution may now present its opening remark.
Thank you, Your Honour. This case involves one of the most important developments in the modern age, where God can be brought into law and order. The insidious spread of lawlessness, terrorism and immorality has been tearing society apart. It is now time for the citizen to be accountable to a higher power. Only in this way can society hope to alleviate its ills. The primary purpose of Sunday legislation is to create social cohesion. Your Honour, the family has disintegrated before our eyes. It is the single most important reason why we have so much crime and social disruption. Our politicians and religious leaders have united together to provide our citizens with a stable and just society. We cannot have this process undermined by minority groups or individuals such as David Bannister. It is our civic duty to give our full support to this vital initiative.
Listen, Terry, I'll take you on one condition, and that is if I have to ask you to do anything, or even if I have to ask you to go home, you'll do it without any question. Is that understood?
Thank you, Mr. Arrabito.
Don't thank me too soon.
I remember when we were in Italy, and I wanted to go and watch a game of soccer, and but I always found that Jim always protected his day of worship, and I have to respect him for that. And as this trip went on and on and on, I started to see that why he was protecting his day. And he didn't force that on me. I had a choice. I could have gone to the soccer game. But for him, he just always said, well, maybe on Sunday would be a better day for him.
You ready?
Yep, ready as I'll ever be.
Where are we off to today?
Well, today we're going to go to one of the oldest and the largest of the ancient Italian churches.
Hey Jim, this is not the Vatican.
No, this is the Chiesa Valdesi. It's a descendant of the Waldensian Church. We can talk about that later. Let's go over and have a look at it, shall we? Terry, why don't you wait here for a minute? Look at this mosaic over the door. See what you can make out of that. And I'm going to step in here for a minute.
I can't make anything of it.
Well, let's step over to the park. We can't talk here. And I'll tell you what it means. Remember the candle on it?
Mm.
That candle represents the Chiesa Valdesi, or the Waldensian Church. The candlestick represents the church itself, while the book underneath it represents the Bible. The 7 stars over the top of it represent the 7 valleys of the Waldenses in the mountains that we're going to visit.
What about the writing?
Well, one of the words was lux, the second one was lucid, and the third one was tenebras. Lux means the light, lucid means to shine, and tenebras means darkness. So it means the light that shines in darkness. You see, the Waldensian Church continued to teach the truths of the Bible throughout the period of the Dark Ages when it was outlawed. And that's what that whole symbol represents.
Did you get what you wanted?
Boy, I sure did, Terry. Look at these. I got 2 authoritative books on the history of the 2 branches of Christianity and the war going on between them.
2 branches.
Yeah, there's 2 branches of Christianity. You see, in the early centuries of Christianity, the church broke into 2 different movements. Each one had their own Bible. Each one had their own doctrines. And each one of them had their own way of dealing with people who disagreed with them. In fact, one of those branches, Terry, is responsible for this law and for your arrest.
Which one?
Well, you study what they teach, and you study what they do, and you compare it to the Bible. And then, Terry, you'll have to come to your own conclusions on that, because that's what we're here for. Listen, I'd like to take you over to the Roman Forum, and while we're there, I'll explain a few things to you.
Would the prosecution now present the charges against David Bannister?
David Bannister has repeatedly ignored the importance of Sunday legislation by continuing his work activities on Sunday, and thereby offends the sensitivities of his God-fearing neighbours and community. The prosecution demands that David Bannister receive an appropriate penalty for his disruptive behaviour in breaking this law.
Defence?
Your Honour, David Bannister here is no criminal. He has no criminal record whatsoever. He's a good, hard-working citizen. The defence will simply demonstrate that this is an antiquated law. It has no relevance to society whatever, and it ought to be abolished.
In determining a fair judgment for Mr. Bannister, I expect counsel to not stray from the facts of the case. The historic issues of this case are far too complex for this small community court to solve. I expect counsel to tread very carefully.
Yeah, I drifted in and out of different feelings. Being overwhelmed with a sense of purpose. Yet, other times, it defied all common sense.
Boy, this place is something, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know why I brought you here, Terry? Well, I mentioned back there at the Chiesa Valdesi that there were 2 branches of Christianity in the early centuries. One of them was Roman Christianity. You know what that one was?
You mean Catholicism?
Yes, Catholicism. That's the largest family of Christianity. Well, before we can understand Roman Christianity, we really have to understand the mind and the culture that it grew up in. And that was this, Rome. Now, if you noticed as we went along through the forum there, that there were many different types of architecture. I showed you the Doric columns and the Ionic and the Corinthian columns. And the domes, the domes came from as far away as Syria. And the pillars originated in Assyria and Persia. And the layout of many of these temples came from Egypt. Every one of these things was borrowed from another part of the world. It was just the Roman mind was an eclectic mind.
What's that?
Well, eclecticism is the quality of absorbing everything, uniting everything. And this was the secret of her power. She could absorb the religions and concepts of the nations that she went into, and they would feel comfortable with Romanism, you see?
I see.
Now, her streets became filled with business people and merchants and religious leaders and thinkers from all over the world. She became a great center of culture. And so you can see why these, the various religious cults wanted the heads of their priesthoods to reside in Rome. And I'll tell you, the Roman Caesar was happy about that because, you see, that's a way of winning the hearts of people by absorbing their religions or paying honor to it. I mean, even the Hebrews, which the Romans had a little bit of a dislike for, Caesar embellished their temple and sent great blocks of marble there and money, to fill it with gold and beautiful artistry and stuff. Well, she did that with all the religions. The religious priests controlled the people, and as long as Rome kept control of the religious priests, she had control of everything, you see. Now, if you go around Rome, you'll see places where there have been excavations of Mithraic temples. Mithraism became probably the most popular religion in the Roman world. It was Persian sun worship. It developed about the time of Daniel, and it borrowed heavily from the Hebrew scriptures and united it with the old Persian sun worship. Like the Hebrew religion, it adopted a seventh day as a Sabbath. Well, that particular day of worship was Sunday, you see. Now, what it did was it called Sunday the day of Mithra, or the day of the Lord, or the Lord's day. And that's how in Romanism it became known as the Dominical day, or the Sunday, or the day of the Lord. Now, another religion that became very popular in Rome was a religion called the cult of Isis from Egypt. And so all over Rome you'll find these little images of a mother and a child. Mother worship was very common in the Roman Empire at that time. Then another religion that actually, I believe, subtly behind the scenes became the most powerful was a religion that came all the way from Babylon.
Babylon.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about a kingdom that was established 2,000 years before the time of Christ. But it was the most pervasive system of religion. And when the Persians conquered Neo-Babylon, these priests fled to the Greek Empire, to a place called Pergamum. And then from Pergamum in about 133, the last of the kings there, he was called Attalus III, bequeathed the entire priesthood of these Babylonian priests that were hiding under the facade of Greek religion. He bequeathed a whole bunch of them to Rome. And within 100 years, they became the cult of the Caesars. Now, these people worship the number 666. They worship the sun. They worship the Mother of God. They worshiped, they used holy water. They had priesthoods. And you know what they called their chief priest? They called him Pontifex Maximus. And you see, that's what we've seen on some of these inscriptions. That was a title they used for Caesar. Well, he adopted all these symbols of the sun god you see around him. Now you can capture the feeling that Rome was the great capital of powerful pagan idolatry. And it was very willing to absorb other pagan religions as long as it increased the power of Rome. But what was happening was when the Holy Spirit was given to the apostles, a new power was breathed into humanity. And divinity and humanity combined started a powerful movement that could not be stopped no matter what. And unlike any other kind of religion, it proselytized among the pagans. The goal was to win people from paganism. Well, of course, that alarmed the various priesthoods, and they began to persecute Christians. And that alarmed, of course, the Roman rulers. They began to persecute Christians. You see, these pagan priests believed that if Christianity was to be left unchecked, it would eventually destroy everything. It would destroy the kingdom. It would destroy their power. Let me read a quotation from the research that I've been gathering that might be interesting, and it adds more weight to this thing. It says, paganism foresaw that should the gospel triumph, her temples and altars would be swept away. Therefore, she summoned all her forces to destroy Christianity. Christians were stripped of their possessions. They were driven from their homes. Great numbers sealed their testimony with their blood. Noble and slave alike, rich and poor, learned and ignorant, were alike slain without any mercy.
That's frightening.
They were leaving the empty religion of paganism and accepting something that filled their hearts and gave them something to live for, you see. And so the persecution didn't stop them. Listen to this tremendous quotation. It says here, God's workmen were slain, but his work went steadily forward. The gospel continued to spread and increase. Said a Christian, you may kill us, torture us, condemn us. Your injustice is proof that we are innocent. The oftener we are mown down by you, the more in number we will grow. The blood of martyr is seed. And Terry, as we face this law, we need that kind of strength, courage, and experience. That's one of the reasons why need to study out this subject, not only to realize the before. Where many Christians lost their lives in horrible ways. The Colosseum. Why don't we go over there?
Let's go.
Your Honour, surely this isn't a law that can be enforced. This so-called noble effort to bring people together under God is no different from religious dictatorship. Setting up a basis for compulsory worship is in conflict with the most basic. By that I mean that every individual should choose their beliefs according to the dictates of their conscience. And furthermore, if we're going to continue to refer to God's day of worship in the court, my client does not acknowledge Sunday, but rather Saturday, the seventh day of the week, as his official day of worship.
There it is, Terry.
Wow, that is impressive.
It's something, isn't it? It's a symbol of the Roman Empire. At the same time, it's a symbol of suffering and persecution of God's people through the centuries.
When did the pagans start this persecution?
Well, it really began in full about the time of Nero, which was about 60 AD. And then Christians were accused of everything. Every time there was a calamity on land and sea, every time a terrible storm came up and crops were destroyed, the Christians got blamed for it.
Yeah.
And as a result, they were thrown in these arenas and died in terrible ways. They even accused them of treason against the government because they wouldn't offer incense to Caesar. They were accused of being atheists and the enemies of all religion because they didn't believe in the pagan gods and they wouldn't bow down to pagan images. Great numbers of Christians were thrown to wild beasts.
Yeah?
Yeah. The amphitheaters were often the location of seeing these people dying as entertainment. You know, a lot of times they wrapped them up in animal skins and then let wild dogs loose on them to tear them apart. Or they crucified them right there in the arena and set up great bonfires to burn up scores of Christians at a time. At other times we read that they...
David Bannister refuses to accept the community's consensus concerning
How
the
do we
sanctity
know
of
this
Sunday.
is community consensus?
Let the prosecution continue.
At a time when social stability is of paramount importance, the actions of David Bannister compromise the safety we all seek under God.
Your Honour, I'm surprised the prosecution is serious about defending the state's right to suppress freedom of conscience. The consequences, to say the least, are alarming. Surely we can't keep removing civil liberties in order to deal with crime. This initiative just appears to be a knee-jerk reaction to fear and to superstition, and it threatens to throw the whole law process back into the Dark Ages.
Your Honour, Sunday legislation represents the will of the people. If it means sacrificing a few civil liberties for the greater good, then we as a community should pull together rather than disrupt the honourable intent behind this law.
Honourable intent? This so-called honourable intent is loosely based on tradition rather than on the interpretation of God's word. Can an accurate interpretation be determined by so-called democratic processes, which in this case is reduced to a reaction to anarchy and to terrorism?
Wow, look at that.
This is the Trebia. Look at here on the map. This is the river that the Celts traveled along to establish the college in Bobbio that we're going to. Come on. Isn't it beautiful?
It's just another village. We saw heaps of them on the way up the mountains.
That's not just another village.
Anyway, what do you see?
I see bears pulling plows.
Bears?
Yeah. And I see young, powerful men felling trees and splitting up the logs and building a school. I see students with leather satchels over their shoulder going to class at the oratory. And over here I see a scriptorium. I see young scholars copying manuscripts of the Bible to give to the people of Europe. And then all over these mountains and valleys I see beautiful fields of ripening harvests.
Has this got anything to do with that invisible church? Hang on, I know why it's invisible. It's all in your head.
Okay, maybe now it's in my head, Terry. But it wasn't in the 6th and 7th century. It was a very real scene back then.
Well, who were these people?
They were Irish Christians from the ends of the earth. And they had come to bring Christianity and education to the people of Europe.
Okay, you got my curiosity. But go slow. This history is new to me.
Listen, why don't we talk as we walk across the bridge? There's some things I want to show you in town.
Okay.
Terry, this town, so far from those noisy towns and cities of Europe, was once the intellectual center of northern Italy. Before this place, there was no school here for the young people. Not one child in 100 could even write his own name. These wonderful Celtic missionaries, the builders of this school, reached this spot in the wilderness after they'd established hundreds of other schools throughout the mountains and the valleys of Europe. They'd already laid a foundation of education in other places. You know, this might be hard for you to believe, Terry, but it was these Christians, not the Roman Christians, These young men felling the trees and building their schools, copying the Bible for their scriptoriums that raised the minds of the people of Europe to a much higher level. They laid the foundation for what you see in modern civilization today. They believed in the Bible as their absolute authority. And they saw Christ as the only mediator between God and man.
The government has confirmed to make the Lord's Day an official day of rest and worship. Surely the defence is not suggesting that we ignore our own government.
It's our democratic right, Your Honour, to oppose laws that are unjust. Therefore, it's my intention to prove to this court that not only is this law unjust, but the bold interpretation of Sunday being God's holy day is erroneous. It's based on centuries of ignorance. You know, Your Honour, one would question also whether there's in fact a covert religious agenda behind the reconstitution of laws that enforce a particular ideology.
Counsel, sidebar, please. Counsel, I prefer this not head into a theological discussion. The court can't be used to discuss doctrine. Please return to your seats. The court will recess for 1 hour. Meanwhile, I would like to see counsel in my chambers immediately. Look, before this becomes a circus, I would like to hear the arguments develop a degree of relevancy to community law rather than a theological debate. Are you able to summarise the essence of the defence's case for me?
Yes, Your Honour. The defence is based on two principles. Number one, the right of citizens to exercise freedom of conscience in all matters relating to religious beliefs and practices. And number two, there's no basis for Sunday legislation that identifies Sunday as the true day of worship. Your Honour, I realise that both aspects of my case involve a religious debate, and you request in the courtroom that this be avoided. But I just don't see how I can structure a fair defence if I'm unable to address what is in fact a religious matter. This law was constituted by a religious organisation, and so this case will need to involve a degree of religious discussion.
Go on then.
As I've mentioned, the issue of the correct day of worship has been argued for thousands of years.
So, what do you believe is the problem with Sunday legislation other than the theological problem?
The problem with Sunday legislation, Your Honour, is that it's an aggressive religious law that negates the right of choice. If this law is permitted to convict our client, then every freedom derived from the democratic processes is really up for review. Governments of free societies should never legislate in matters of church doctrine. What we're faced with now is having to incorporate theological exposition right in the courtroom, which has the inherent emotional mixture of religion and civil law.
Well, let's get down to business on this other branch of Christianity. It begins with the Jews. The Jews were scattered all over the world. At first, 700 years before the time of Christ, and then with the Babylonians about 600 years before the time of Christ. The Jews had been scattered along the trade routes. The great nations of the world had taken Jewish communities and placed them on their outer borders of their kingdoms in order to build up society. What they wanted to do was protect their borders from the invasions of other tribes. And because of this, the Jews became very, very prominent. They became great traders, and they always educated their children well, so they were highly cultured. When Jesus told the apostles to go out, he told them to go first to the lost of the tribe of Israel. And so already there was a foundation for Christianity around the whole world. Now, the Christian movement was powerful. During the first century, Christianity went to the entire inhabited globe. Now, I know people don't realize that today, but it was a big movement. Because the world was broken up into major family or language groups, Christianity was broken up into a Greek-speaking group, a Jewish Christian group. It was also had a Gaelic-speaking group. That's the Celtic people, later to be the Irish and the Welsh and the Scottish and the French. And then there was another group, the Latin group.
Hang on. 2 branches. How come you're mentioning more?
Well, yeah, but that comes later. There are 5 branches of ethnic Christianity, but they were all one great church. From Ireland all the way through Asia, they all believed the same things. Listen, in the first few centuries of Christianity, they all basically believed the same thing, so you only had one Christian church at first. The church split over the issue of power primarily, and that was in the 4th century during the time of Constantine. Now, the Apostle Paul evangelized Greeks and Latins, and he also evangelized the Gaelic people. You've heard of the book of Galatians in the Bible? Okay, well, the Galatians were the Celtic people, and they had relatives all the way from Mongolia across the globe to the islands of Britain and France and Gaul and Spain, you see. So when he evangelized these people, they loved Paul. They thought he was really special. And they began to tell their relatives about it. And for years, missionaries came from Asia Minor, from Ephesus, and went to Gaul, where the rest of the Gaelic people were, and they spread Christianity right up into the British Isles. So by the end of the 2nd centuries, there were Christian communities all across the globe. That was just one branch. The Jews, when Jerusalem was destroyed, went over Jordan into a place called Decapolis, and 100 years later, they migrated up to northern Syria, which was Antioch. Antioch became kind of the great missionary headquarters of the church. And in time, those Syrian Christians, which some historians have called the Waldenses of the East, brought the knowledge of Christ to almost all the nations of Asia, all the way to Japan.
Yes, this has actually changed my life incredibly. There was a world of information out there that I was ignorant to, and I had no understanding of history. And at first I wondered whether I'd be overwhelmed with all this information and whether I'd go home, just give up. But as time went on, I started to see that there was a bigger picture to this whole issue of the Sunday law, and actually who was behind it.
Well, go on then.
The lessons of history should remind us how dangerous it is for society to support the union of the church with the state. Over the centuries, literally millions of people have been slaughtered because of a religio-political initiative that arbitrarily attempted to impose religion on the masses. Those who didn't submit to the church's dogmas and laws, including this law, were identified as the vilest of heretics, and they were sentenced to death just because their religious convictions conflicted with a church under the control of a state or a state under the control of the church.
Surely you're not suggesting that society would allow this to occur again?
And
That's if it occurred like you say it has.
And surely you're not for one moment suggesting that it didn't happen. Imposing penalties for failing to observe Sunday legislation is a violation of one's conscience. Whenever a state imposes a penalty for complying with a law that doesn't exist outside religion, the state really, Your Honour, is engaged in religious persecution. Civilised communities should resist any attempt on the part of governments to enforce what is effectively a state religion that compromises our religious liberties.
Look, my responsibility in this court does not concern the history of religion. It is concerned, however, with whether or not your client has engaged in behaviour against the community's interests and the law.
I understand that, Your Honour, but the history behind Sunday legislation is relevant to the prosecution's case because those who want Sunday protected actually argue from history. The truth is, Your Honour, I cannot provide my client with adequate defence unless the court is willing to examine the historical premise on which Sunday legislation is based. Only then can we ascertain what might happen to be against community interests.
I know we don't hear about this in history, but it's true. They could count their converts by the millions. The Syrian Christian church was the largest church that ever existed on the face of the earth, bigger than the Catholic or the Latin and the Greek church combined. Now, at the same time they were spreading in the East, the Gaelic branch of Christianity, the Galatians, remember in the Bible, that had been evangelized by the Apostle Paul. So they had his theology, apostolic theology. They were evangelizing their relatives all the way through Europe to the British Isles. And then in the 3rd and the 4th century, we read about Christian missions being set up in Wales and Ireland. In the 4th century, you heard about a man named Patrick, St. Patrick of Ireland. Well, he was one of these early Gaelic Christians. He evangelized the Irish kings and set up schools all throughout Ireland. And these young people, they studied for 18 years. They studied Greek, Hebrew, Latin. Some of these schools had 3,000 to 7,000 students in it. Ireland was called the University Island, and people from all over Europe sent their children to Ireland in order to get an education. Well, in time, some of the kings of Europe invited Irish missionaries to come into the forests of Europe to set up schools here in Europe so they wouldn't have to send their children so far away. And they invited a man from Ireland, a man by the name of Columbano. And now you know where Columbanus came from. Well, at first he worked in France and set up schools there. And then he and his missionary friends made their way through the Alps of Switzerland and into the valleys of Europe. He was pursued by the Roman Church for a period of time and given protection by kings in Lombardy. Finally, he was given an area of the forest down here in southern Lombardy to establish his last school. And like I said, it became the great intellectual center of Italy. In fact, at the time of his death, in 615, they found that the library here contained representation of every branch of knowledge known in his day. Listen, these men literally changed the world that they lived in and gave us the quality of life that we have today. Otherwise, you can just imagine what things would be like if education was suppressed like it was during the Dark Ages. Now, the Gaelic Christians of the West and the Syrian Christians of the East, through the centuries, met in conventions up here in these very mountains. And it became a great Christian center. And it was never connected with Rome. Rome didn't conquer this area until 1,000 years later. The Roman Church called them the Valdesi, or the Waldenses, or the people of the valleys. Remember the church in Rome? When we started our trip.
Oh, yeah.
The Chiesa Valdesi.
Yeah.
That's the branch of Christianity that we need to study next. The reason is because in the early years, the Roman Church wasn't organized to fight the church well. Her evangelism spread all over Europe. But beginning in about the 12th century, Innocent III established something called the Inquisition. Have you ever heard of that?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I think somewhere in the neighborhood of anywhere from 60 to 200 million people lost their lives during that time period. For 400 years, the Christian church in Europe received one death blow after another, but she kept rising to the fight, all the way to the Reformation. Now, those crucial 400 years are where you and I are going to get a perspective on this warfare between this church in the wilderness and the great Roman church. And I really think we ought to be in the Waldense valleys for that discussion. What do you say we head up in that direction?
Good.
Compulsory legislation was first instigated by the Roman Emperor Constantine in 321 AD. He was supported by many of the bishops at the time. And one of them, Eusebius, who by the way happened to be a very close friend of the emperor's, came forward with the teaching that Jesus had changed the Sabbath to Sunday, but he produced no scriptural support to back up his new teaching.
That's completely untrue.
Look, it's my understanding that Sunday sacredness has always been a Christian teaching.
And so it has, Your Honour. It is common knowledge that the Jewish Sabbath was done away with at the time of Christ's death. Also, according to the New Testament, Christians worshipped on the first day of the week to celebrate Christ's resurrection. And that's easy to prove from Scripture. Let me read from Acts 20, verse 7. And upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow, and continued his speech until midnight, unquote. Surely this is clear biblical evidence of the validity of Sunday worship in the New Testament.
Defence, isn't this clear to you?
No, Your Honour, not at all. We're simply told that Paul met with his companions on Saturday night to break bread. And breaking of bread in Bible times just meant simply sharing a meal together. We even still use that term from time to time today. The text simply says that Paul was leaving his companions on Sunday morning, and so they had a last fellowship farewell meal together on Saturday night, ready for Paul's departure the next day. In those days, Saturday night was the beginning of the first day of the week, for the Jews kept their days from sunset. So really what this text is saying, that Paul and his companions met together for a last fellowship meal. Paul preached on till midnight. A young man fell out of the window and Paul raised him to life again. And then he kept preaching till the morning, and he left at daybreak to walk 30 kilometres to the next town, Assos. Now, he would not have travelled that distance if he felt that Sunday was a very special holy day.
Okay, prosecution. Do you have any other biblical evidence to prove that Sunday is the correct day of worship?
The Bible was still being written when the change to Sunday occurred, so the evidence is incomplete. However, it has been accepted by most Christian authorities that the apostles observed the first day of the week in commemoration of the resurrection. Throughout history, the Sunday Sabbath has been embraced by the Christian church as a whole, and that's not a fact that anyone can deny. The defence mistakenly believes that the Jewish Sabbath is the Christian Sabbath.
Well, you appear to have history on your side, but it isn't clear that you have biblical support.
Not a very big, large opening.
No. Imagine having church in a place like that.
Yeah. Great.
Well, Jim, it's about time you laid it out for me. You've been holding back on me on this information about the Sunday law, and you said once we got up here in the hills you'd tell me all about it, and I want to know more now. I've been pretty quiet up till now. And another thing I want to ask you too, those books that you've been referring to, how do I know that they're true? How can I believe them?
I figured you might get a little more serious with me after a while. But the thing is, I felt I really needed to show you a few things before I could get down to the more serious side of things. And you'll have to admit, passing through the Vatican had a real effect on you.
Yeah.
And gaining an understanding of the early Christian church from the Gaelic perspective, establishing education in Europe, that added a whole perspective to Christian history you didn't know before.
No.
And now I think you pretty much see that there are two branches of Christianity. So, let's get down to the issues. I'll ask you a few questions. What if it was proved to the satisfaction of the public that there was an older and purer Christian church datable back to the apostles, and that it wasn't the Roman church? How does that make the Roman church appear? And what if it could be shown that these primitive Christians, the Waldenses in this case, had an older and purer Bible? Then what does that do to the Bible of the Roman church? It makes it look like a fraud again. You see? If this church could be traced back to the time of the apostles, then it makes it clear that the Catholic Church is the heretic. You see what I mean? We have a Sunday law because socially it appears to be appropriate to close businesses and to shut down work on Sunday, a Christian holiday. But what if Sunday wasn't a Christian holiday? What if Sunday was simply a sign of the Roman Church's authority? Why, then the whole thing is a fraud. And the legislators would have to go right back to their books again. The Roman Church has tried to make it appear that the Waldenses were a small church and originated in the 12th century. In this way, they can avoid the accusation that they're the heretic, you see. Not only that, they broke up the primitive church under many different names, such as Pasagini, Valdenses, and the Bogomils. You know where the word boogeyman came from. It came from Bogomil. And the name voodoo came from the word voudois, which was a name of the Waldenses. They also gave them other names like Sabati, Insabati, Baptist, Anabaptists, and Paulicians and Petrobutians and Henricians, and on and on and on, to make it look like there were many different little groups, when in fact they were one vast religion that was older and purer than the Roman Church.
Your Honour, the Jews were the recipients of God's blessings, and they were the guardians of the Word of God. But they were not the first to introduce the seventh-day Sabbath, as our prosecution has been suggesting. It began actually at creation. In Genesis 2 and verse 3, the Bible says, on the seventh day, God ended his work. That was the work of creation, of course. And it says, he rested on the seventh day from all the work, and then he blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he rested from all his work which God created and made. The Sabbath then existed for thousands of years before there were any Jews. And it's important to notice two words in that verse. He blessed and he sanctified. You see, he blessed the seventh day. That means God put a blessing in the seventh day that he didn't put in the first day or any other day of the week. And then he sanctified it. He set it apart for holy use. So the Sabbath, therefore, was very important to God. And that's why many Christians down through the centuries have also looked on this as a day to be honoured, as does my client today.
I'd like to see where that's written in the Bible.
There we go.
It makes a very clear distinction in the Ten Commandments. The fourth commandment says that God's people are to work 6 days and they're to rest on the seventh day. There's no other meaning to the seventh day at all beside that. And doesn't it concern our prosecution that it's the only commandment that begins with the word remember? 8 of the others begin with thou shalt not, and one begins with honour your parents. But this one begins with remember. Let me quote it. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy.
Wait a minute. Where do you find that?
It's in the second book, Exodus 20 and verses 8 to 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shall you labour and do all your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that in them is, and rested the 7th day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. You see, the 4th commandment, Your Honour, refers to the 7th day of the week, not Sunday. And these are literal days, not symbolic days. Days of the week back there originally were numbered, not named. So it was not Sunday, but was the first day. Not Tuesday, the 3rd day. Not Monday, the second day. Not Saturday, the 7th day. The 7th day Sabbath is a part of the law that Jesus came to fulfill and to uphold. In another place in the Bible, in Matthew 5:17 and 18, Jesus said, think not that I'm come to destroy the law or the prophets. I'm not come to destroy but to fulfill. And that Greek word there, fulfill, means fully to preach. In another verse in the book of Isaiah, it said he came to magnify the law. That means to bring it out in a better and richer and fuller light. And then he goes on here to say, verily I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, not one jot or tittle shall in any wise pass from the law till all be fulfilled. And respectfully, Your Honour, the last time I looked, heaven and earth hadn't passed away. They're still here. And yet Christians keep 9 of the 10 commandments, but the only one that commences with remember is the one they seem to forget. And this principle is clearly understood by a court of law. We must keep the law in full, not in part. And that's an issue not overlooked by my prosecution friend here in relation to a case against my client. Interestingly, the Bible itself takes up the same issue in James 2, verse 19. Whoever keeps the whole law and stumbles in one point, he's guilty of all. You see, the problem arises when a conflict comes between God's law and the law of the land. And the Bible says in that case, in Acts 5:29, if you want the verse, we ought to obey God rather than man. And Your Honour, the defendant has sought to resort to a higher power in this particular instance.
Yeah, many of the recent terrorist attacks use the same argument, Your Honour.
We're hardly dealing with terroristic behaviour, Your Honour. The divine law says, 6 days shall you labour and do all your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. And my client has observed this law to the full. He's worked hard for 6 days, which is more than a lot of people do today, and he's kept the 7th day Sabbath. It seems ludicrous that he stands to be prosecuted over this very thing.
The defence fails to realise that if Christians were meant to observe the 4th commandment, then Christ would have specifically mentioned it in the New Testament, in the same way he told the people to observe the other 9 commandments.
Where exactly did Jesus say, thou shalt not covet? It's not anywhere in the Bible. And that 2nd commandment about images, making of images for worship, you won't find that in the New Testament either. And yet most Protestants accept that that 2nd commandment is still binding. I suggest the prosecution is on very shaky ground. Very, very shaky ground.